on this topic. And so I try to bring in some alums and current students who have sort of a vested interest in thinking about what does it mean to do philosophy in times of crises. So I'm going to sort of introduce people really quickly in terms of how I know them and how I think of them in terms of relationship to philosophy and also what they're doing currently. Rebecca had already done sort of their credentials, but I'll tell you a little bit about my relationship with them. Lacey Davidson is now a professor at Cal Lutheran, so it's part of the ELCA, the same organization that Wittenberg, same wing of the Lutheran Church that Wittenberg is part of. And that's been really exciting because that gives Lacey and me some opportunities to work together in a range of ways. And I've known Lacey forever, from her being my student, to her babysitting my daughter, to her having like Thanksgiving dinner at my house along with her brother for 1,000 years, which was great. And we still actually miss those days of Thanksgiving dinner with Lacey. And Lacey and I have worked together. Lacey and I have actually published together. Right now we're actually working on a blog based on an article that we had written together on implicit bias, and that article is actually coming out this year. Karlos Marshall is from 2013, and Karlos is really exceptional in a range of ways. Karlos is from Springfield originally and has really dedicated his life to Springfield and really thinking about what racial justice, economic justice, and educational justice look like in the city of Springfield, but also more broadly. He's a founder, along with another Wittenberg alum, of the Conscious Connection, which works to think about really educational and environmental justice issues and the way they impact really sort of need-based communities, and how to specifically target those communities based upon the needs of those communities. And Karlos was one of Forbes's 30 under 30, which is pretty impressive. And as Rebecca says, he's the new director and really founding director of the West Dayton Incubator, which works with underrepresented communities and helping them start up entrepreneurship businesses in West Dayton. Ethan Bochicchio will be the next speaker. And Ethan he's gave you the wave. He's out in California right now. He transferred into Wittenberg just last year. Excellent student. Somebody asked me right away whether I had met him, and then he came to my office 20 minutes later and we talked for 2 hours. Ethan has been really involved in a range of ways politically, especially for a student. So one of the things he's done is he's done a lot of refugee work and has actually traveled throughout the world doing refugee work before he came to Wittenberg. And I think he'd probably be doing that right now if there was not a global pandemic. So he's a senior this year, and he's doing an independent study with me this summer and on theories of anarchism. And then I'll be speaking next. So as Rebecca said, I'm the chair of the philosophy department at Wittenberg. I've been at Wittenberg since 2000. It's near and dear to my heart for a range of reasons. But really because, I've, like many of you, I've sort of thought about what it means to commit my life to not only to my discipline of philosophy, but to the institution I work for. I'm also the new founding director of the Wittenberg Institute for Public Humanities and Sciences. And that's a new institute that we're starting up this coming year. And we're really excited about that because it's going to help us work to make the connection between the kind of work we do as academics and broader ranges of public issues. So the kinds of things we're talking about today really play into that. Bhattarai is our next person. She's gave a wave there. Kira is a philosophy and computer science major, which is a really unusual combination, but a very adept combination. Philosophy is very logical. Computer science is really very logical itself. And so there's lots of crossovers in between. She's also been my faculty aide for the past year. She helped me organize a pretty large international conference that was hosted by Michigan State, where Wittenberg alum Chris Long from class of 1990 is a dean. Lacey was actually there also. It was a really great conference. And Kira has helped me throughout the year on a number of projects that have been really important. And then Greta Anderson, Greta's there, she's gave a wave. Greta just graduated in 2020. Greta was my supplemental instructor, has helped me in a number of different projects. She actually did some editing work for me recently. She's really exceptional. She was philosophy and political science, and she is planning to go to law school this fall. So that's our rundown. Our topic is philosophy in times of crises. And Lacey's going to start off by talking about what that means by a theme. And then we're each going to talk for 5 to 7 minutes. And then as we go on, please feel free to type into the chat. Greta is super efficient and super organized, and she's going to organize our chat so we can have some good conversation at the end. Lacey, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much for that great introduction, Nancy. It's good to be with you all here today. I'm in Minnesota, northern Minnesota right now, and there are a lot of mosquitoes. So if I'm swatting, it's not about you, it's about the mosquitoes. So as Nancy said, I have now the great honor of teaching philosophy at California Lutheran University, which is a small liberal arts college also affiliated with the ELCA like Wittenberg. So in this portion of time, I'm going to walk you through the philosophical journey I've been on with my students since the stay-at-home orders were announced. And I'm hoping this can be a way that we can think about together how we might go about doing philosophy in times of crisis. So like so many people, my students and I experienced a great upheaval in March. As we transitioned to virtual instruction in the middle of the spring semester, I reminded my students that this change in our collective experiences was a great time to think philosophically. So I challenged them to spend some of their newly opened or changed time to explore their inner worlds, to spend some time journaling and kind of thinking the big thoughts that philosophy encourages us to think. So I said to them a lot, philosophy is not just a way to occupy your time. Some of my students found they had more time than they've ever had, but that it's also a way to critically engage with and bring new understandings to your experiences. So that's how I kind of started out thinking about what this means to do philosophy in times of crisis. But then it became pretty clear that the crisis of COVID-19 was disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. And it seemed pretty clear that the public health crisis was not going to be swiftly managed. So then this brought up a new kind of thing, allowing me to urge my students to use their philosophical skills to think about those circumstances. Think about the information that they were being presented with on the news and on the internet, and to use their philosophical skills to give explanations and analyses of inequities in healthcare. So again, this now seemed like a new and better way to do philosophy in times of crisis. And then as our lives have changed again with the uprisings calling for racial justice that are happening all over the United States, I again said to my students, this is the time to do philosophy. How can philosophy help us understand our world and our engagement within it? How can we change the structures that we live in so they're more equitable, so that they promote justice? So I just kept evolving sort of in thinking about what it meant to do philosophy in times of crisis. So this journey and my reflections alongside my students brought me to this question. So there's another question, as there always is in philosophy. I've been thinking about, what does it mean to be newly in crisis? In other words, what is it about me and my particular position as a white woman working in academia? It meant that I was experiencing uncertainty and crisis at a new and unprecedented level. So what does it mean to be newly in crisis? And I think that you can ask that also for yourself. What is it about your position or your identities? We all have different ones on this call that have shaped your experiences of the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and of racism that we're experiencing in the United States and globally. So now I'm going to get kind of meta-philosophical. So this journey and these considerations brought me really forcibly back to the method of doing philosophy that's advocated for by Dr. Leonard Harris, who was one of my dissertation committee members when I got my PhD at Purdue University in Indiana. So Dr. Harris advocates doing philosophy born of struggle, or philosophy born of the process. And many times this struggle is the struggle of like fighting for one's life within an unjust system. So this is a quote from Lee McBride. He's got a new book out talking about Dr. Harris's method. So this is a quote from him. Philosophy neither begins with high caste leisurely men seeking eternal truths for their own sake, nor does it begin with anonymous reasonable beings behind a veil of ignorance, working in a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. So this is like maybe Descartes and Rawls, you're hearing in there if you've done some history of philosophy. So philosophy as Harris conceives it, this is McBride again, begins with the full range of human experiences, including genocide, slavery, exploitation, misery, degradation, cognitive dissonance, and cynicism. This philosophy, born of struggle, should help people assess their situation and facilitate the mitigation of struggles and misery, the actual experiences of surviving human populations. So that was McBride talking about Harris. So this method of doing philosophy, one that's different than the one that Aristotle or even Socrates, we think of Socrates asking crowds questions. This method is very different because it starts with the contours of people's lives. And in particular, the struggle against various forms of oppression and the specific modes of violence that arise from these systems of oppression. So rather than thinking about, for me, what does it mean to do philosophy in what is newly a crisis for me, I've come back to really trying to think about what does it mean to do philosophy? What questions will we ask when we start from the experiences of incarceration, policing, lack of access to equitable health care, lack of access to affordable and stable housing, transportation, or equitable work. When we start with fears about bodily safety, or fears about access to quality and culturally responsive education, or having enough nutritious food. So I think when we start with these contours, the contours of people's lives, it allows us to rethink what it means to do philosophy in times of crisis. And it urges us to look to those who experience the worst of our systems for guidance. So rather than me looking to my own experience, maybe I'll look to others who experience consistently the worst of our systems, particularly if our lives are changing for the first time or the first time in a long time. We can look to those whose lives are constantly under threat for guidance and for philosophical thinking. And as Dr. Harris would say, to the work that people are already producing to understand the world and the ways that we can make it better. So I'm hoping that some of these reflections and the progression of my own thought throughout this pandemic time, through the time of racial uprising, can help us think kind of metaphilosophically about what it means to do philosophy in times of crisis. So thanks so much for listening. I'll pass it off to Karlos Marshall.
Hey, thank you so much, Lacey. As a Lacey illuminated in her introduction, very honored and privileged just to be able to share this stage with philosophers of varying stages of their careers, and just to be also in a space with so many alumni that want to engage in this topic. I'm going to follow up on what Lacey had mentioned, just in terms of access to access and opportunities, which in many ways has been exacerbated by COVID-19. And I'm going to focus specifically on parallels, but speaking, based on my work at the University of Dayton, speaking specifically within the context of Black businesses, underrepresented entrepreneurs, founders, and creatives, and looking specifically at the intersections brought on by COVID-19, as well as a resurgence of Black Lives Matter. In many ways, kind of a second awakening and a second call of action across all sectors, but also paralleling the many inequities and disparities across multiple sectors, which really demonstrates and highlights how and why, in fact, that these things are systematic, structural, and systemic, and not just merely coincidental. So one of the things when Lacey talks about the healthcare disparities within the country related to access to healthcare, again, this has COVID-19 in many ways has brought a lot of things that are routinely swept under the rug to the surface, to where they can no longer be readily ignored. So when you're seeing, there's a old saying from an African American proverb and adage that said, when America catches the cold, Black America gets pneumonia. So whether you're talking about COVID-19 and the disproportionate impacts on communities of color and communities of lower socioeconomic status being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, right? That's not right. And we hear this term over and over again about underlying conditions, which really is in many ways a devoid, looking at the systematic structural issues, a lack of access to healthcare, testing, or whether you're talking about state-sanctioned violence, or the economic turmoil and fallout that has happened across an array of various different sectors. But I want to pay specific attention to the barriers of access to the SBA's, Small Business Administration's PPP loans, or better known as the Paycheck Protection Programs. This is why you see really a lot of business owners that have access and have these type of networks are really in many ways profiting in some ways is based on the loans that have been provided by the government. Obviously, we're continuously disproportionately impacted, Black folks in general, by the ongoing virus. So, if you're an individual of color, right, you can't. We're not just facing COVID in isolation. We're also looking at institutional racism and what I will refer to as societal suffocation of just culture of life and of the various necessity that make for what is neighborhood vitality and community vibrancy. So with these PP protection loans, what we've seen is bank after bank after bank said that they're going to prioritize quote unquote pre-existing relationships, or quote unquote underlining priorities. The impact that this has is that many Black business owners and entrepreneurs were not able to get access to these PPP protection loans because they did not have these pre-existing relationships with traditional banking industries. But the irony of that all is that Black communities were also largely blamed for by so-called medical experts, public health officials, elected officials, and the likes, why communities of colors had higher COVID-19 death tolls. And conveniently, that language was quote unquote pre-existing and underlying condition, which demonstrated really a paradox in calculated language from my perspective that was nothing more than an attempt to deflect structural and personal accountabilities for those responsible for Black lives, for ensuring that Black lives and Black businesses matter. So again, I want to caution us to look at what causes these disparities rather than looking at the disparities themselves in isolation. And again, access to capital is not a new issue for Black entrepreneurs. Several years ago, there was a 5-year study that was conducted on venture-backed companies. So if you're a venture-backed company, it just means that you have received venture capitalism and capital infusion, in which that venture capitalist is most likely taking a portion of equity out of your company to invest. Based on a 5-year study, more than 10,000 founders were polled, but only 1% of venture-backed founders were Black. And this is discriminatory practices with venture capitals or VCs, as well as angel investing networks, and as traditional banks, as I just alluded to. In the Black Enterprise magazine attributed this to being a $4.4 trillion lost opportunities by not investing in Black women, as well as women founders as well. And I do want to underscore that point as well. Part of my job at the University of Dayton is supporting Black, brown, and women entrepreneurs and founders. So that is critical to notate, although I am focusing specifically on Black businesses here. And all that, the $4.4 trillion, really lost opportunity is all really on the basis of what Charles W. Mills would define as not a social contract, but really rather as a racial contract, being a tacit and at times explicit agreement among members of a Eurocentric identity to uphold a certain level of elitism and community that, you might not necessarily be afforded all of the opportunities because you're white, but you certainly aren't going to be excluded from said opportunities because you are white. And according to all Black business publications and magazines, Black women are starting more businesses than any other demographic in the country. Since 2007, Black women-owned firms have increased by 164%, despite the intentional disenfranchisement. And unfortunately, from the margins in which they're starting businesses well faster than or way more than any other demographic, they're still not able to get access to capital. And this follows a long legacy of, the dismissing nature of the contributions of Black women as industry leaders, as change agents, as well as vanguards of social change movements. So I think it's also critical for us to look at the intersections of both race and gender related to COVID-19, as well as Black businesses. Black Lives Matter was actually founded by 3 Black women, but we still have to continue to advocate for why it's critical to say her name and to bring awareness to Black women that have also been impacted by state-sanctioned violence at the hands of police. You can see that right now with the media attention that George Floyd is receiving, but Breonna Taylor just down the road in Louisville is not receiving that same type of recognition. So again, want to definitely pay attention to the intersectionality of both race and gender here. And then, just in closing, I think it's also critical to intend that Black Lives Matter never contended that other lives did not matter, right? Black Lives Matter is providing a voice, a platform to give, to really give rise to, those voices that are those voices and those bodies that are really subjugated and valued less. So Black Lives Matter is really Black Lives Matter too, and providing that platform. And Black businesses matter seems to posit the same. I believe that to suggest that Black Lives Matter is anti to any other racial ethnic group would really be contrary to the very existence of Black folks on this soil, considering that we were essential workers well before the term quote unquote essential workers ever became popularized, right? And what you see based on COVID-19 is when the economy was opened up, largely as we can see, not due to health reasons because it was safe, but really to salvage what we could of a certain economic collapse. Blacks are more likely to have essential jobs than any other demographic group. So when you think about that Black employees are having to go back for these essential jobs and risk their lives on the line, but Black founders aren't able to get access to capital, and their businesses are really being deemed quote unquote non-essential for life-saving measures from publicly funded aid to keep their businesses breathing. is extremely problematic and kind of gets to the exploitation that Lacey was alluding to, which certainly connects to, Marxist theories of an alienation of labor. And I close with this. I think it's very, very critical that interracial society, right, that this notion that being non-racist is not enough, that we must in fact be anti-racist. And Ibram X. Kendi is positing a lot of work around this concept of anti-racism in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So I would just encourage us to continue to think about, race neutral policy isn't the absence of racism, and in some instances can proliferate racist ideologies and racist outcomes, right? So what we need is not race neutral policies. We need anti-racist policies, practices, and philosophy that challenge archaic philosophies, thoughts, and beliefs. And that kind of closed the summation of my section. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ethan.
Hello. I'd just like to start by saying I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Professor McHugh, for that introduction. I'm talking about state-sanctioned violence in times of crisis. So anarchist Emma Goldman wrote in 1910 that all forms of government rest on violence and are therefore wrong and harmful as well as unnecessary. And in liberal democracies like our own, that violence has to be justified to the public in order to maintain the democratic facade. As Noam Chomsky points out, the more free and popular a government, the more it becomes necessary to rely on control of opinion to ensure submission to the rulers. In order to maintain maximum control, state violence in the United States is accompanied with some sort of justification, oftentimes the exploitation of a crisis. The state violence that we are seeing today is the product of years of police militarization justified by various crises. So Black Americans have been uniquely subject to state violence. As Charles Mills points out, white supremacy is a political system, quote, based on a contract between whites. Western societies are defined not by a social contract, but a racial contract where, quote, non-whites are relegated to a lower rung on the moral ladder. The contract is accompanied by what Mills calls an epistemology of ignorance, a set of stereotypes and bigotries. That epistemology reinforces itself through the innate confirmation biases that every human has. Cherry-picked stories and unsubstantiated narratives are given credence as long as they fit within that epistemology. So in 1971, Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs, allowing future presidents to use the threat of a drug crisis to justify state violence. The war became a concrete manifestation of the epistemology of ignorance. During Ronald Reagan's campaign for the presidency, he used dog whistles playing on white fear, describing the archetypal criminal as, quote, a staring face, a face that belongs to a frightening reality of our time, the face of the human predator. Michelle Alexander writes that Reagan's, quote, highly racialized appeals were nearly always accompanied by vehement promises to be tougher on crime and to enhance the federal government's role in combating it. As part of George Bush Sr.'s presidential campaign, ads were run that played on white fears of Black sexual deviance. The ads told the story of the assault of a man and rape of his fiancée by Willie Horton, a Black man who had been on a furlough program approved by Democratic presidential candidate Michael Dukakis. As Jesse Jackson said at the time, the ads were, quote, designed to create the most horrible psychosexual fears. In office, Bush signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act of 1990, which, in its section 1208, allowed for the transfer of military materials to law enforcement agencies for the use of drug enforcement. On January 24th, 1992, Ricky Ray Rector, who had killed the police officer and then attempted suicide, was executed. His failed suicide attempt resulted in effectively his own lobotomization. During his last meal, it was reported that he put pie aside for later, unaware of his imminent death. Then Governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, paused his presidential campaign to return to Arkansas to oversee the execution of Rector, proving that he would be more tough on crime than Bush was, the subtext being Black crime. In the 1990s, Reagan's human predator was replaced with the racist super predator, a term famously used by then First Lady Hillary Clinton in 1996, which she later apologized for. Bill Clinton also widened military transfers to law enforcement with the 1033 program, further allowing military transfers to police departments for purposes other than drug enforcement. And after 9/11, the Bush administration would exploit that program, turning American law enforcement agencies into the paramilitaries that they are today. After the killing of Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson, the city of Ferguson, Missouri erupted in protests. The police response to the unrest shocked many. Armored vehicles drove through the streets surrounded by heavily armed riot police. 61 people were arrested, many of them just for taking part in peaceful protests. The most violent acts during the protests were committed by police, who shot 3 people, used tear gas, batons, etc. And while many primary sources uphold that protests were always peaceful until police antagonized. Obama issued Executive Order 13688, which put a freeze on transfers of certain types of military materials. But as Seth Kirshner reported, quote, the total value of equipment distributed through the program actually increased the year following the ban. And of course, in 2017, Trump reversed Obama's executive order anyway, which brings us to today. Mainstream media covered the May 30th protests in Los Angeles as if peaceful protests had miraculously turned into violence and looting. Speaking as a primary source, what actually happened was protests were peaceful until the police asserted their presence. After a marginal group not consistent with the event's organizers, the police car that was left mysteriously unmanned in the path of the march, police began using excessive force against peaceful protesters. The police occupied an alleyway as if to reclaim lost territory with riot gear and rubber bullets. Meanwhile, streets were blocked off surrounding protesters while police with batons beat unarmed men and women. I have footage where you can hear people pleading with the police, no, 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 right before the police fire a rubber bullet indiscriminately into the crowd. It was a culmination of years of police militarization being used on peaceful protesters. In the United States, people are acutely aware of the awesome violent capabilities of police. When the police provoke a violent reaction from a crowd, like they did that day, the crowd's violent response is not directed towards the police, as people understand the potentially life-threatening risk they would be taking. Only after a violent reaction is provoked does a crowd direct violence towards its immediate surroundings. And thus, a crisis was manufactured. On the back of the violent protest narrative, the state radically escalated violence around the country. At least 12 people have been killed by police at protests since they began in May. Protesters, journalists, medics, and unaffiliated bystanders have been subject to tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets, which, to be clear, are not non-lethal weapons, as they are described by the police and media. Rubber bullets oftentimes are large metal bullets encased in rubber. And between 1984 and 2017, 53 people have been killed by rubber bullets, while 300 people have been permanently disabled. Tear gas can also be lethal. Sarah Grossman in Columbus, Ohio, died after getting tear gas on May 30th. So in order to get control of the crisis situation, which was manufactured, 31 states, along with Washington, D.C., deployed their National Guards. In Los Angeles, despite local media using small business safety rhetoric, they were deployed in front of banks and high-end shopping malls. Nationwide, 80 localities implemented curfews. The ACLU filed suit against the city of Los Angeles over the curfew, saying that it constituted a, quote, extraordinary suppression of all political protests in the evening hours, and that it, quote, plainly violates the First Amendment to the US Constitution. Curfews, all they do is allow for police to operate without anyone watching them, and they're effectively a suspension of habeas corpus. So if we want to end the exploitation of crises, police must be demilitarized. That means challenging the purpose of their militarization in the first place, which of course is rooted in white supremacy. If we're serious about democracy, people have to be able to protest without a police presence. We must understand that protests don't just turn violent, they're provoked by violence. And finally, we cannot allow the onus of a crisis created by the state to be placed on the people. That only allows for further state violence. And we do this by engaging with the movement that is currently taking place. Massive institutional gains have already been made, and with continued effort, state violence will be a thing of the past. And with that, I'll pass it off to Professor McHugh.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And the gear I'm going to switch to is, so the question we've been asking is, how can we use the tools of philosophy in times of crises? And the gear I'm going to switch to is thinking about what does it mean for philosophy itself to be in a crisis. And so one of the things that's happened in 20th century philosophy, so if we go back, we can go back in the history of philosophy, and philosophy up until the 20th century was really used, or part of a means for thinking about how to improve society. So whether it was someone like, so if we go back to Socrates, for example, Socrates was executed for crimes against the city of Athens. One was basically being a natural scientist, in other words, investigating the things in the heavens and below the earth, so engaging the world in a scientific manner. The second was worshiping false gods. The third was he was accused of charging people for speech, which he didn't do. And the fourth was for corrupting the youth. And so what Socrates saw himself doing was going out into the public and asking hard questions, asking the questions that people didn't want to ask. As we've moved through the history of philosophy's done that in a range of ways, some of which were better and some of which were worse. But the tradition of philosophy has been one to think about how can the tools of the discipline be used to engage a larger range of issues. So whether it's thinking about how to engage the world through science, whether it's thinking about what justice looks like and how we can enact justice, or whether it's thinking about what does injustice look like, and how can we, alleviate or remediate injustice. So those have been the projects of philosophy up until the 20th century, and through that, philosophy was very much an expansive discipline. 20th century comes along and philosophy shifts gears, and it's sort of interesting historically how that happened. But part of what happened is, and this is sort of philosophy backing away from a crisis, part of what happened is with the atrocities of World War II and the genocide that took place in Europe, the anti-Semitic genocide that took place in Europe, part of what happened is philosophy shut down its desire to engage with the material world. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, much of which was, the military then, this was during drafts, right? And so the military was made up of a wide range of people, and most people who were studying philosophy at that time found themselves in the military, as many people, many academics themselves also did during that time. And they backed away from the materiality of the daily world. And so as we move philosophy up through the mid 20th century, through the late 20th century, what we see is actually a shrinking of a discipline. And one of the reasons why we see the shrinking of the discipline is it became unwilling to engage some of these harder issues that we've been talking about. Every single thing that each of these presenters have talked about are really hard issues to talk about. They're issues that we shy away from. They're issues that when we confront them, we confront something about ourselves, whether it's because we agree with them or disagree with them, whether it's because we think it's an important issue or not an important issue. Each of those requires us to confront something about ourselves and the society in which we live. And so, they result in harder questions and harder conversations, many of which we tend to not be well prepared to engage in. And so one of the things that I've been arguing for, and many other philosophers now are arguing for, is this sort of thinking about how philosophy can make sure we go back to sort of re-engaging the materialities of daily lives. So we should be having conversations about police brutality. We should be having conversations about not only the nature of the science behind COVID-19, but who gets treated, who doesn't get treated. How do we attribute disease patterns? How do we think about where we should put resources? All those things are important questions that we should be asking. Karlos raised a question about how do we allocate, money in times of crises, right? Who are we missing and why are they being missed? If the goal of, if we have structural systems that are set up so that people of color are less likely to be networked into those important economic institutions that then in turn give them access, not only in times of crisis, but also in times of normalcy. How are they disproportionately harmed or disproportionately don't receive benefits in these sorts of situations? And so what philosophy ends up being really good at, I think, is doing a range of things. One is philosophy is particularly adept at asking questions about what we know and what we don't know. So Karlos and Ethan both referred to Charles Mills, and Charles Mills makes the argument that in many ways we exist in what he refers to an epistemology of ignorance. And what that means is his descriptions that we exist within this sort of collective state where there's all these things that we think we know, but they aren't actually the truth. And there's all these things that we don't know and that we should know. And because we are looking in one direction for knowledge and not looking at the other, we have a really hard time at solving social problems. So one thing that philosophy is really good at is getting us to think about not just what we do know, but what we don't know and what we should know. And it allows us to sort of shift our gaze in a different kind of direction. The other thing I think philosophy is particularly adept at doing is making normative claims. In other words, by normative claim, I mean, what should we do? How should we act ethically, right? So what does it mean to act ethically in situation X? And, one of the things I tell my students all the time is, one of the things that we all need to think about is not just what is it that I will do, but what is it that I won't do, right? So where are we going to draw our line in the sand? And many of us ask ourselves that question too late. I really like it when I can get, 18-year-olds to start asking themselves, what are the principles behind which you're going to stand, right? What are your, what kind of issues do you feel like you have to have integrity on? And how will you not, how will you stand behind those positions? Because the point at which you really have to ask that question, at the point of crisis when you have to ask it, it's too late. You need to really have an understanding about who you are and what it is that you stand for. And then it becomes much easier to think about how you're going to deal with the material crises that are in front of you. So philosophy sets us up with the habits and practices to be able to do those sorts of things. And so, the argument I would make is if philosophy itself wants to move out of crises, we need to sort of reinvigorate this tradition of really, engaging with the materiality of the daily world as opposed to sort of hiding from it, and really need to work on not just thinking about the hard questions, but thinking about how to ask questions, how to frame ideas, how to make, pushing people to make normative claims. Pushing us to look at the things that we might not be seeing, but that we need to see. And from there, I really think that we can start to think about not only reinvigorating a discipline, but really adding substantially to public life, right? So how can we have these conversations and help people on a broader scale think about, how to have these conversations and how to act upon their values and convictions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kira.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what kind of questions we should be asking. And like the first thing to think about, I guess, is why should we even be asking questions? Why should we even be thinking about these things? And it's kind of important to understand that the way things are right now isn't the way that things should be, and it's not the way that things are going to be forever. And so unless we want to have a world that's worse off, we need to be thinking about how we're going to make it better in whatever ways we can. And you have to keep an open mind. There's a lot of problems that might never affect me or might never affect any of you, but they're going to affect some people. And just because I'm not aware of them, I still want to be careful to avoid dismissing them as problems altogether. It's important, I think, to not worry about asking like the right question. Because when you ask people questions that you think they want you to ask, you're not really learning anything. It's important to ask the questions that you have in a way that lets you learn. Because when we stop asking questions, we're going to stop making progress altogether. So that brings me to critical thinking, which is one of the very valuable things that philosophy offers. We should be thinking critically, probably about everything, but especially in times of crisis, we should be thinking critically about what is happening to the people around us and to our whole world. Critical thinking means that you're analyzing the information that's presented to you for yourself. You're not looking at it the way that people are showing it to you. You're looking at what they're saying and you're looking at whether or not it makes sense. Does it make sense? You kind of have to think about it without the influence of other things. You want to look at whether or not it's logical, find gaps in the logic. Are they just saying these things, or do they have reasons or like statistics to back it up? Is there information that like gives you more information? And you want to go beyond the surface level of any issue. You don't just want to look at the issue and think you understand it, because all of these things that we're having crises with right now, they're very complex, and it will take a lot to understand them. So we have to go beyond just asking why. Like, if you wanted to ask, why don't people vote? It's more than just asking, well, why don't they vote? You have to ask, well, what kind of systems are in place, or what kind of laws are in place that are keeping them from voting? Or like, how do these systems work? So whenever you ask why, you should ask like what or how, and probe further into the things that you're asking. The goal, I think, of philosophy, or one of the goals of philosophy, is to kind of just increase our understanding of what is happening, which we can then use in a million ways. But you can't increase your understanding of something if you don't even, if you don't think about it, or if you don't question it. If it's worth thinking about, then it's going to stand up to a little bit of questioning. And then one of the things that prevents people, I think, from asking questions is the fact that these topics like race and equality and health and what it even means to be an American, they're pretty personal topics. It can be a little bit hard to navigate a conversation about these things because they're so personal to so many people. You don't want to hurt someone's feelings or offend them, but you might have a genuine question, or you might have a thought that you change your mind about. And so there's two parts to this. The first is that we have to become okay with being uncomfortable. This is not a comfortable situation. We're in a crisis. We passed the time for comfort a long time ago. And if we were all comfortable, if this was all easy discussions, we wouldn't be in a crisis. These wouldn't be things worth talking about if they weren't things that made us uncomfortable a little bit. But when you learn more, or when you think critically, or when you ask more questions, sometimes you change your mind about things. And I think a lot of people, personally, I feel really uncomfortable when I change my mind about something, or when I acknowledge that I've changed my mind, because it means that I have to admit that at some point in the past, I was wrong about something I thought or something I said, and I might have defended what I said because I believed it to be true. But now I've learned more, and I've realized I don't believe that anymore, or I don't think that way anymore. So it's a little bit like touchy to change your mind. It's also uncomfortable, and we have to be okay with being uncomfortable. If we were comfortable, we wouldn't be talking about these things. So then the kinds of questions that we should be asking questions that examine the systems around us and examine the things that we kind of like take for granted or we don't really look at very much. So things like in the earlier example, why don't people vote? Well, there's a lot of different systems and laws in place that make it difficult. We need to examine those further and think about them. And we need to ask the questions that make us uncomfortable and kind of sit in the discomfort for long enough to understand. And then most of all, I think we should be asking questions that make us reevaluate what we think and what we believe. Because, well, it seems really scary if you're going to reevaluate what you think. Like, it definitely feels like a daunting task because maybe you re-examine your belief and you realize that it doesn't actually make sense the way that you thought it did, or it goes against another belief of yours. Or maybe it doesn't align with the kind of person that you want to be. But if that's the case, then once you think about it, you have the ability to modify your belief or change your belief or just change your mind altogether. And then you can also look at your belief, you can really think about it, and you can realize that it's a strong, well thought out belief and like you still stand by it. And if that's the case, then you only end up leaving that experience with like a comfortable, confident like view and feeling of your beliefs. You know that you've thought about them a little. So it's mostly we should be asking the questions that will let us learn more, but also that make us a little bit uncomfortable. The questions that come out of thinking critically and kind of guide how we want to make things. We don't want the world to stay the same. We obviously want progress. And so the questions we ask should be kind of inquiring into that, looking at the things that are holding everybody back, whether or not you personally or I personally am being held back by these things, and examining them, even if it makes us uncomfortable. So that's all I've got.
Okay, Rebecca, did you want to, I don't think we have a whole lot of questions in the chat. Oh, actually, we do. Greta, do you want to handle the question in the, there's a couple questions
Sure.
in the chat. Why
So
don't you
here's
go for
a
it?
good one to start off with. And so this one says, this is kind of simple, but for the benefit of a non-philosophy major, can you give us a philosopher's definition of philosophy and what exactly are philosophical skills?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
whoever wants that one.
So who wants to go for that one? Greta, you want to go for it? You just graduated.
No.
No. Well, philosophy means the love of wisdom. That's what the Greek term means. But I actually think it's a lot more than that. So maybe just each of us can say something really, really fast. So love of wisdom for me, it's a process of thinking critically, creatively, and compassionately about how to live in the world. Lacey, you want to go next?
Sure. I think philosophy is a methodology, so it's a way of looking at the world, engaging critically. Joseph Weeks just put my favorite definition of philosophy is the art of making useful distinctions. And I was going to mention conceptual analysis. So in a Platonic dialogue called Meno, Socrates and Meno are talking with each other about what virtue is, what counts as a virtue. And it turns out that Meno just keeps giving examples of virtues. And Plato says to him, I don't want to know examples of virtues. I want to know what a virtue is without having to give an example. And so that's the kind of work that philosophers do a lot of times is what I would call conceptual analysis. But it's like this useful distinctions piece is like, how do we look at the world around us and really sometimes it's finding, sometimes developing concepts that are useful for us in thinking about the world. So if we're thinking about what is justice, as Nancy asked, we're going to give a conceptual analysis of what we think counts as justice. So I think that's one thing that philosophy does. It's really important.
Karlos, what do you think?
Absolutely. You know, in terms of skills of philosophers or philosophers, you know, obviously the analytical skills, but I think which is oftentimes lost within the skills of philosophy is the ability to be pragmatic and to be actionable, which is why I think that this conversation that we're having here this afternoon is so critical. Obviously, the ability to be able to communicate and to articulate critical reasoning, argumentative skills, as well as the ability to be able to conduct independent research. So those are some of the critical skills that I believe that philosophers bring to the table. But I also think that obviously, as Nancy alluded to, philosophy being the love of wisdom, I think that philosophy is as much about having the ability and really even the audacity to a certain extent to unlearn to unlearn old things and old thought patterns and way of beliefs as it is the ability to learn things that are new. So just challenging preconceived assumptions and ill-informed notions is also very, very critical to the work of philosophy and philosophers.
Yeah, Ethan, how about you?
I sort of understand philosophy as like the refusal to accept things at face value, and certainly like the love of wisdom, which is why I think in all fields there's like the philosophy of music, the philosophy of science, because there is something more in all bodies of knowledge that we can get to. Yeah, I'll keep it short with that.
Kier, what add?
I think in the TV show The Good Place, which was a really philosophic TV show, there's one episode where this all-knowing robot, Janet, is asked, like, what's the meaning of all this? And I really liked the answer because it sounded optimistic, and because I usually, when I look at philosophy, it usually seems so like down and depressing, but I really liked the answer that philosophy, well, the meaning of existence is like finding happiness in the insanity of being here now. And I think philosophy does that, because without philosophy, it's kind of hard to find the meaning in anything. So I guess that would be my answer.
So that actually like ties in really nicely with another question, which is philosophy is really good at being critical and pointing out how far things are from how they ought to be. This can be pretty depressing though. Do you see philosophy as also being hopeful? Does philosophy help us find optimism for the future and ways to change the world for the better?
First. So I'll tell you how I describe myself as a philosopher. I describe myself as an action-oriented philosopher. And what that means is I've never been able to understand the work that I do as just, you know, I write a lot, you know, I write a lot and I do a lot of teaching. And those are types of actions. But for me, really, a lot of the substance of my philosophical work happens out in communities. So I teach in prisons and juvenile detention centers. I'm working with the Kettering Foundation right now and coming up with ways of thinking about changing prison reentry from prison. How do you develop more successful reentry programs? I do medical ethics. I'm in health justice work. I work on environmental justice issues. And I wouldn't be doing any of those things, if I didn't think there was the ability to make an impact, right? So for me, actually, you know, the depressing part is philosophy helps you to understand the problems. And I always sort of joke that you're not a good philosopher unless you have some sort of like major existential crisis at some point. But I also think that the next part of being a good philosopher is picking up and understanding that what philosophy has done is giving you the tools to do something about that. It's giving you the tools to figure out where actually you can insert yourself and create change, and give you the impetus for doing it. And so that's primarily, you know, why I do the stuff I do, why I focus on what actions philosophy can do, what actions I can engage in, as opposed to just it's not just a peeling away project, it's a building up. If anybody else wants to speak to that.
I would also add, I mean, I think that like if we understand the world as bleak, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't have hope. Chris Hedges, who's a journalist and a philosopher in many ways, talks about how like hope can be entirely pacifying. Sometimes after like the end of our philosophical deductions, like we reach the conclusion, as Karl Marx does, that everything is messed up. And when we're at that conclusion, like if we're hopeful, like that's assuming that somehow things are going to change. Things aren't going to change unless we change it. So I think that in many ways, the hopelessness that comes with like philosophy and studying society, like, is a call to action.
Okay, so this is a question asked by Webby. So bear with those of you who don't know Webby, you'd like to know Webby. But Webby asks, what exactly is the crisis we are in and how do we know that? Such a Webby question.
Webby, do you want to answer your own question?
Yeah, sure. You actually want me to, I will. Do you actually want me to?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I think the way we know what crisis we're in is routinely what are we seeing as the depictions of the crisis contrary to reality. So if we're routinely seeing things as, I don't know, either crazy or going fine or whatever, I think the way we know whether it's like what crisis we're in is to kind of look at what's going to change about what we see. For example, if with coronavirus, it's nothing, we have it under control, it's slightly getting here, but it's going to be fine, we're taking precautions, and then now, you know, we're at like 2 million Americans with it or whatever it is. I think we just have to assume with whatever seems to be a problem on the horizon that it's already here. So that's kind of how I know what crisis we're in, because by the time we know about it, it's already here.
Thank you, Webby, for answering that. Okay, this one's a little bit long. But so this one is, in a time of crisis, both as exemplified by the Black Lives Matter protests and the pandemic, an overriding theme seems to be the desire for control of inherently uncontrolled or uncontrollable situations. Police seem to want to control the streets, not merely to protect property, and it goes without saying, without regard to life or liberty, or at least to symbolize state control, while a protest itself is an act that is antithetical to state control. Similarly, COVID is a force of nature outside of the control of a society, and the state's efforts to manage the crisis is, as much as anything, a question of how much control can be exerted over the populace. Wear a mask, stay indoors, close the parks, etc. In contrast, I would posit on some level, our nation's collective desire to give up on managing the coronavirus is a bizarre assertion of control by denying the coronavirus's ability to affect our lives and the economic and social lives. What does philosophy have to say about control in these contexts?
Yeah, related to control, specifically related to Black Lives Matter. I believe that it is, in a sense, to control, maybe not necessarily in a sense of authority over the lives of others, but really ownership and onus over the lives of individual beings of Black folks. Huey Newton has a quote related to control, or really power, in which he says, power is the ability to define phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner, right? So that's what you're seeing right now in Black Lives Matter, is they're defining the phenomenon that goes well beyond state-sanctioned violence to a number of other systematic injustices that the panel here has alluded to, related to health, housing, voting rights, and you're seeing that. And now, again, why do we take to the streets? Why do we petition? Why are we asking for accountability of elected officials, of people in government positions? That is again, the act to make the phenomenon act or react, rather, in a desired manner that begins to value life and all of the other things that come with that. So I would say that Huey Newton, when you're looking at Black Lives Matter in terms of power, control, certainly looking in the early work of radical philosophers, Angela Davis also posits, right, that freedom is a constant struggle, right? And I think that kind of gets to the positioning of why people have now, seemingly given up on fighting the coronavirus. They're tired of this constant struggle and conflict, in which people feel like their rights of liberty and just to be able to pursue happiness is now being restricted by something that in many ways they believe is outside of their realm of control and ability to define and make to act in a desired manner, right? So Angela Davis, again, just positing that freedom is a constant struggle. That's what we're currently seeing with COVID-19. But I think it's important to remember, though, in terms of when we're talking about philosophy in a time of crisis. Again, I think that we're only now just defining it. I mean, I think that there's power in the ability to even define this here very moment as somewhat of a crisis, given the fact that many communities of lower socioeconomic status, many communities of color, and we can even see this in relation to things that continue to go on related to immigration and ICE and deportation and really concentration camps. That this is an ongoing crisis for many people that don't have the privilege to be apolitical or acultural and have the ability to determine when we engage in these critical conversations and dialogues. For many people, this is a necessary to be constantly engaged in these conversations as just well-being, welfare, and just human recognition and validation. So that's what I would say in relation to both power and control.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that question?
Could I, real quick?
Sure.
I would just also add on the coronavirus point is like we've seen a lot of right-wing media talking about how civil liberties are being taken and all like the sort of fear-mongering over the stay-at-home orders. Like that's not really how the state is exerting control right now. I don't believe that the state in any way cares about the coronavirus. During protests in Los Angeles, they shut down testing centers. I mean, like was mentioned in like detention centers, ICE detention centers, like people are not being kept 6 feet apart. They don't care about the coronavirus. What they care about is that a bill was passed that's triggered what's being referred to as the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history. That's like what I think where we need to be looking at while people are worried about like the control of their personal lives and stay at home and can I get my nails done and stuff, and working, of course, like there's people who are suffering with these stay at home orders. I wouldn't want to minimize that. What's really the way that the state is asserting control is by sweeping economic reforms that we will never hear the end of.
And I can also add to that. That's a great point, Ethan, in terms of a real life example, positing it back to economic recovery, and the PPP loans are already obviously articulated just how underrepresented entrepreneurs and founders are not getting the same access to the state access, right? And in many ways, many people are profiting right now in dramatic ways, and that social economic disparity gap and margin is widening. But in South Springfield, which is largely where the Black population in South Springfield lives, and you have people with lower income levels. We had a grocery store, probably the only grocery store in South Springfield. Kroger's left. I don't know how long ago that was. That was probably like 6 or 7 months ago. But over the course of this weekend, on Saturday, I went to deposit a check from our nonprofit at the bank right there on South Limestone, a PNC bank who we've been banking with for over 5 years. And when I approached the door was locked, and there was a sign on the door that said that due to a quote unquote abundance of precautionary reasons, this bank is closing for safety precautions. It's temporarily closing for safety precautions. my immediate guttural reaction that it, but they also said that you can go to the bank. I think their banking location on East Main and another one on North Limestone or somewhere else in the city. My immediate reaction to that was that it was discriminatory because on the one hand, they're saying out of all of the numerous locations, banking locations that they have in the city, only this specific banking location, which is serving a predominantly underserved population, is one that we did deem to be a health risk, which is many ways reinforcing negative stereotypes that is somehow not the people in the systematic structures that is exposing people to the dangers of COVID-19. And then in the back of my mind, I was thinking that this is an intermediate play to something much larger. And without hesitation, on Monday, I received a letter from PNC Bank in my mailbox saying that location was now going to be permanently closed. This location is just within a rock's throw of where the Kroger's left, making this a food desert. And now this is also a banking desert. There's no other bank within this geographical region in South Springfield. So again, understanding that these things are not removed from the hollows of the campus of Wittenberg, but they're also drastically impacting the lives of people that live right side out of what many would believe to be a gated community. So just not having access to banking, not having, financial resources is very, very disheartening. And yes, it is on South Limestone Street. So again, as Ethan mentioned, related to the widening economic disparities, access to capital, financial services. Again, we don't have to look far or wide across the nation to see everyday examples of how this is occurring on a structural and systematic level.
Thank you. Okay. Facebook, Twitter, Fox, CBS, CNN, MSNBC. So what is the truth? And will our society, the United States of America, ever again agree about what truth is? And if yes, how will this happen?
This is a great epistemology question, Melody. So this is exactly in line with the kinds of questions that philosophers ask. There's tons of good stuff about the news. So another thing that philosophers do is push back on the questions that people ask. So that's what I'm about to do. So I think there's a question about whether we ever agreed about what the truth is, right? So there's people who have experienced various forms of oppression, including enslavement and other forms of oppression throughout our history, where there's a very large disagreement about what the truth is, right? And so I think the idea that there was somehow of course I'm relatively young, I graduated from Wittenberg in 2012, but I think the idea that there was a time where everyone agreed on sort of what was happening and the function of our systems and the purpose of our democracy and the purpose of our political systems. I think that idea of agreement and kind of a situation of like transparency and full knowledge, I think that is a part of something that we would want to interrogate and really think through. Like, was there a time where we had a singular truth that everyone assented to? So I think it's a great question, especially around media literacy and where we get our information. I think those are all really good, important epistemological knowledge related questions. But I don't think there was a time where we were in agreement about the truth. But I think through, so you asked, how will this happen? I do think we're at a time of extreme, maybe partisanship, extreme people pulling away from each other, like blocking people on Facebook. And I think sometimes there are really good reasons to do that, to protect yourself, depending on your identity. But I think engaging in the kinds of conversations that Kira was talking about, where people are uncomfortable and you're willing to maybe have some of your views about yourself, how you think about yourself, how you think about the world as challenged, and kind of both, sometimes that happens both ways, depending on like what side, again, even like the ways that we have to talk about the world are like also deeply partisan. So I think it is really important to engage in critical conversations with each other. Like my parents are 84 and 63, and we were having dinner the other day and we talked about what does it mean to defund the police, like because they were thinking like that's impossible, we can't do it. But to have the conversation, not that we came to a conclusion, but to be able to have a conversation where we really thought it all the way through, and we like challenged our self-conceptions and thinking about where we grew up and the experiences we've had. So I don't think there's going to be agreement. I think that power, those in power will always try to cover up the truth of what's happening. But I think that's part of the skill of philosophy.
If I might say that with respect to all those news channels, one good question is cui bono? And as you say, Lacey, what we want to do is try to have that discussion. What the news wants to do is just put defund the police on there and then repeat those words over and over again so that you get afraid and sit still and watch all these wonderful messages from our kind advertisers. And you'll never find the discussion actually taking place. Something like that is incendiary and sounds extreme, and it sticks, so it sells. And so, at least when it comes down to what is truth, the question listed a bunch of media outlets. One thing I would consider is that it is very true that they're all interested in making money off your viewership and not in hashing out ideas in a responsible way.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I think we have to choose to have the conversation, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the things that's really hard right now is because we're so polarized that in a weird way, in which you're having a conversation, it's like the one Lacey described with their parents, there's like this leap of faith that when we have the conversation, we actually are going to work to have a mutually respectful conversation. And that the goal actually is to come out of the conversation either, I mean, we could say we want to have more knowledge by the time we come out of the conversation. That's a really important, lofty epistemological goal. But the second order goal, or the equally important goal, but maybe not second order, is that we continue the respect for each other as we go through those conversations. And I think that's, one of the things that I like about philosophy is philosophy doesn't teach us to argue dispassionately. It actually teaches us, one, to differentiate between opinion and argument, and two, that the argument's not, your argument can be an impassioned argument. In other words, you care deeply about the points that you're making, and you care deeply about the impact of your argument, but that it's focused on how can we support the claims that we're making, and what kind of evidence is there out there? And the point that Joe is making about the media, I think, is a really fair one, because I'm not sure that there is as much concern for, one, the evidence, for two, an outcome of continued mutual respect, because in fact, what they function really well on is media functions really well in crises, right? I mean, I'm not saying well as in giving us lots of information. I'm saying they make a lot of money from crises, and so they function really well. And so there's actually a book. There's a book called The Merchants of Doubt that came out in 2010, and a philosopher that I work with, whose name is Lorraine Code, has a new book out called Manufactured Uncertainty. Is that in a lot of ways, media benefits from manufactured uncertainty, right? From causing certain kinds of levels of doubt in us, because that means we keep tuning in. But the best way to shift that uncertainty is through hard and persistent conversations, and learning to listen well, and learning to be sort of humble in our, some of the stuff that we're talking about here is not always easy stuff to hear, but what benefits most of us is learning to hear well and to think through those things, and then at some point maybe thinking about whether we disagree or agree or not, but actually reserving that disagree or agreement until we've let it sit with us for a while. And I think that's an incredibly important skill that most of us need, and it's not all that easy to acquire.
And then if I could add also on like the conversation on how do we get to the truth, of course, like everyone I think has sort of echoed that we've never agreed on anything. But I would just point to Chomsky's manufacturing consent should be required reading for everyone before they graduate high school. One of the things that he talks about is how one of the ways that the state line is parroted is by relying on the state as a factual source. So like, for example, in El Salvador, there'll be a slaughter of in the 1980s, there was a slaughter of hundreds of peasants, but the state says that 5 people were killed. What's reported in the media is state police say 5 people are killed. That's all the information we get. We have to start understanding the police and the state as a biased actor, particularly in situations with protests. Chief Michael Moran of the LAPD is given tons and tons of time on cable news to speak as if he is some sort of bearer of truth. He's a biased party in what's happening right now between protesters and police. We're getting police figures in articles in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. Maybe as to get to the truth, we start questioning the impartiality of the state in the way that they report figures and the way that those figures are parroted in the news media.
Well, I guess to piggyback off of that a little bit, again, we all need to think critically.
I think that's great. What a great conversation we've had here today, everyone. At this point, I want to kind of jump in and start to wrap it up. I think we could probably go on and chatting about this for forever. And I just want to really thank alumni and students who all took the time to tune in and have this open conversation. It's really refreshing to have a platform like this that we can do this on. Before we head off, I want to let everybody know that there's going to be a recording of this session on our Virtual Ways to Engage page. So if there's anything you missed and you want to go back and check it out, we'll have that available for everyone. And then also, before we hop off, I think it would be fun if we could get a little screenshot. So if you've got your video on, why don't you throw up the W and I'll take a quick screenshot of everyone in here. All right, tiger up. I got to remember to smile this time because last time I was focusing so hard on taking the picture, I looked ridiculous. All right, one more.
Can I say real quick though? Alums, if you're ever back on campus, please, you're welcome to sit in the philosophy classes. I love that. And so you're welcome to come in, you're welcome to come visit. We're hoping that the Institute's going to open this fall. That's the plan. We're hoping to have a physical space. So if you're interested in coming by to visit that, please feel free to do so. You can email me to let me know. And I know a lot of in-person stuff is going to be hard for a while. Kira and I were running a, what do we call it? We called it Lunchbox Philosophy. So 1 to 2 Thursdays a month, we were running a series in which, we were running it in person for a while on specific topics in philosophy, and then we were running it virtually for a while. And virtually was really fun because we were getting Wittenberg people and non-Wittenberg people and alums and all kinds of stuff that we wouldn't have reached again. And we'll continue on with that probably virtually in the fall because we're not going to have much ability to do large face-to-face conversations. So please feel free to join us, and I'll try to make sure that stuff gets in the Wittenberg Facebook page.
Thank you, Nancy. That's perfect. So yeah, thanks everyone. And I hope everyone stays safe, healthy, and sane, and keep an eye out on your inbox because we'll have more opportunities like this to come. So have a great evening and thanks again. Bye.
Thank you all. And thanks everyone who helped participate. Take care. Thanks.